Hey, it's Chris, Liege Games. Among Cultists. Spin-off of your Mafia, your Werewolf, with a combination of your more recent pop culture phenomenon, Among Us, in a tabletop format. Social deduction, thriller, upgraded, but also more complex. What do you need to know? Is it right for you? Pros, cons, my thoughts on it, hopefully to help you figure out whether or not it's right for you. Let's go. Social deduction games are relatively straightforward, right? Find the hidden traitor. This is no different. This takes, like I said, a classical spin of the tabletop version of Among Us, if you're familiar with that. If you're not familiar with that, don't worry, because it really doesn't affect it whatsoever. You don't need to have any knowledge of that in the first place to play this game. Essentially, what you've got going on in a 4 to 8 player game here is a hidden cultist among the investigators who is secretly trying to sabotage their decks in terms of placing a dead card in them and having them then revealed to be dead in order to win the game. You need to kill a certain number of investigators, or you need to vote out or kill the cultist, vice versa, or last 10 rounds. This is a narrative experience-based game, and it doesn't venture far outside of the confines of normal social deduction games in that sense if you're looking for something completely different. But it also plays on the tropes that you know within this genre as a whole, so that it was familiar, but in a new way, in addition. And they take a different route of things in terms of incorporation. And again, you have to be very careful with the setup, more so than most of the other games you'll play like this, because essentially you put all of those starting cards that the people may have in this envelope, and you have to pass the envelopes out. And so you need to make sure this is done with the utmost precision to not screw the game up from the get-go. So for starters here, this is what the board looks like a little bit at the beginning of the game. You're going to have your investigators here in the middle. Now, for the purpose of this video, you'll notice that my discs are actually black. They're supposed to be sticker double-sided. My review copy, unfortunately, was missing those, but serves the same purpose. We just used the Scooby-Doo villains from the Deluxified CMON version, which thematically and on this board actually is very fun. However, in this game, you are essentially taking your little hockey puck, if you will, and moving from room to room. The first phase is moving up to 3 different rooms, and you can utilize this to go basically anywhere you may want to. The second phase of things is going to be drawing one of the random events. Events essentially are just going to get in your way. They're going to wreak havoc among the actions or the opportunities that are going to be happening in the third phase or the third round potentially. And that's what's going to be the crux and the gist of this game as a whole, is how you're going to be interacting not only character actions, but also the room actions. And that's why where you go matters. You're drawing these event tokens for the 10 different rounds from this bag in order to incorporate them onto this board so you can keep track of where things are at, depending on how much time you may have left, either to score your victory points, eliminate enough investigators, or figure out who the cultist is and expose them. Because the third phase of things is going to be where you are taking said actions. If you have your character, your disc, in a room, you can do a room action. However, you can also do a character action, which is going to allow you to interact with not only the room, but potentially anything else in the room. Now, here's the tricky part. What I didn't show you in the first phase of things, this is also where the cultist really is trying to strike. Because if you're not familiar with the hidden traitor mechanic of Among Us, in the same sense, they're trying to sabotage. They're trying to kill without being found, as is the basis for almost all of these social deduction types games in this genre. And this is no different, except in this case, you're actually going to have what we call is a pulse deck, utilizing these pulse cards, which are essentially going to be your lifeline. But you don't know necessarily what's in this deck. The only way that this deck gets cards added to it is if you end up in a location with another person, only one other person, because again, in the game of life, it's a he said, she said, if only 2 people are in the room. However, if there are 3 in the room, this encounter doesn't happen. Unless electricity, which is represented obviously by this light bulb here, is turned off. Then anytime you're in a room with more than one person, boom, encounter goes. And what happens is you take one of your lifeline cards and you put it into somebody else's deck. but you don't know who's the cultist. So you don't know if they're putting not one of the lifeline cards in your deck, but one of the ones that are going to kill you. See, flat red line, that's what that represents. And so that's what you're going to having to be discovering. So essentially what you can do on one of the character actions, for example, is look through someone else's life deck to see if they're still alive. Because you're trying to figure out, did that person they just encounter in this round kill them? And if you're killed, well, actually, you don't get eliminated. And that's probably the biggest benefit of this game as a whole, is it does not have player elimination. Player reduction, in the sense of what you can do as a ghost, but you don't actually get eliminated, which is the main critique of this genre of game in the first place. The second pro of this game is really the action mechanism sequencing that they have done as a whole with this. As you can see here, we have a card that the investigators get, but the actual cultists get one too. The difference is the cultists just basically get to ignore this. But this says you can only take certain actions, and it's by number, and the cards are all asymmetrically different, not only necessarily in color and action. So that gives you a lot of variety there. So it's not just a simple, oh, they went there and did this, therefore they are. Well, they only might have options in that room that's going to be very limited. So they might be trying to get to a certain room, which may inevitably run them into somebody that is the cultist. And let's be clear, in the lower player counts, just like Shadows over Camelot, if you're familiar with that, the 4, 5, and 6 player counts are only going to give you one cultist. So the other aspect, pro and con, both in this game, is going to be, I'm going to make the argument that this is probably best at 5 or 6, because there's going to be more mystery in who's the cultist. 4 is just less optimal from a social deduction standpoint, so you don't necessarily need me to tell you that great aha moment, right? 7 and 8 is going to give you 2 cultists. And similarly to other games like Murder in Hong Kong, if you're familiar with that concept, not in mechanistic approach, but in who you can be, because at the higher player counts, 5, 6, 7, and 8, the game actually, on the back of the rule book, gives you a complete listing of who else you can be and what else they do. Now, I'll say, as a con with that aspect of things, it's probably not as complete or as to your liking, if you will, if you're looking for an experience more like Blood on the Clock Tower, which is a storytelling narrative style of deduction game, but has a ton more asymmetry. It's a little bit not as intuitive, and I think part of it is because this game has been translated into multiple languages. How does the mechanical errata work in a game like this? Is it really as clear as it could be? Once you play several rounds, it will become more intuitive. But the barrier to entry, because this is going to run you probably a good 25-minute plus teach, that's going to be something that you have to ask yourself and say, hey, is that something that my group can really dynamically handle? It's not going to be as complicated as Stationfall. It's not going to be as complicated from an overall standpoint as, say, like I mentioned, Blood on the Clock Tower. But it's going to be a significant step up from any of your Mafias, Werewolves, Avalons, Quests, whatever else you prefer, if you're a fan of this genre in the first place. Similar approach, but the dynamics of what's going on the board, the meta style system that you're going through in the Among Us skin, if you will, is going to be significantly more. Because not only are you having those lifeline decks that I mentioned, because you have success decks associated with every room. You also have the vote action over here, which is a separate action in a separate room. You have, as I mentioned here, the electricity, which changes the dynamics of the game as a whole, whether it's on or off. Because when you succeed in an area, you flip this over, events may happen additionally, because that's also going to lead you to one of the successes of this game as a whole. How do you win, essentially, right? If you're not able to kill the cultists, well, you don't necessarily have to. You actually are going to be gathering these wee little tiny book tokens here. Don't know why I did the accent there, but maybe it's just a wee little tiny thing. And you're going to be placing those over in the lower right-hand corner here, which will allow you to score victory points. 3, 3, 4, 3, 2, 2, 2, 2, based on essentially the number of books in the shelves that you fill. But these books are going to be scattered throughout all of the rooms on the board, and you're going to have enough successes to be able to pull them over here. But the cultist can actually force them to be brought back. And so if you can score enough points, great, you win. It's predetermined based on the player count. So that dynamic is going to be there. That's shifting depending on how disadvantaged the cultist is. But it's also going to be an alternative win condition if you'd rather not try and vote and miss. Because last thing you want to do if you have the numbers is lose the numbers. But we'll talk about these book tokens here just a second as well. These are freaking tiny, right? And comparatively, I mean, I've got this blown up. You can see what they are. But if you're looking anything at all away from them, they're not as easily distinguishable, which, you know, for a game this size, I know they did it to match the board size, but you should have just made them less aesthetically trying to appear like little tiny books and just basically colored them. It makes it harder to discern if you're any distance away from the table whatsoever. And again, it's just a little tiny hiccup that can get in your way. And yes, you will be placing these successes or these fails, depending on if you're the cultist or the investigator, into these event decks right here to figure out if you have enough in order to achieve the ability to get some of those books for scoring victory points in the first place. But a la A Dead of Winter, you don't know who's going to have placed what in what pile in what room. Can you keep track? Well, you better hope so, because the dynamics and the interactions and the meta, it gets really tense over a course of several rounds already. And so as it goes longer, who can you trust? How can you trust them? Do you dare go into a room? Because again, let me be very clear. When I say if you ever go into a room, it's not like, okay, I went to this room and I went to this room. Oh, I'm actually going to go to this room and then this room. No, if you ever pass a room with anybody else in it, it immediately triggers that encounter. So how you space things out, even as the investigators, it becomes a game of paranoia. More so, I would say, with an actual physical representation than just a simple werewolf mafia, I accuse you, I accuse you, I accuse you, paranoia for no reason, because that's otherwise what these social deduction games turn into. And this gets away from that trope in a positive way as well. The other tricky aspect here is what the components, the victory conditions, and the deck layout is for everything from 4 to 8 players. And it's very nicely laid out in the rulebook. However, this is the sort of thing that you need to be aware of as a whole with this game, is that this is not going to be a perfectly balanced, perfectly asymmetric, harmonious game in terms of necessarily investigators versus cultists. For example, some people are really not going to like the fact that these pulse card starting decks essentially mean that 2 people are going to potentially start off dead. Now, it's not 2 because you'll see 6 players, 7 cards because one of them is discarded, but that means that potentially 2 of them might be dead at the beginning of the game and you might not even know it yet. And this game has a very fragile meta as well if you're not very careful with some of the smaller, but more even importantly, rules. When you have your hand of cards with your success cards and your failure cards that you are potentially placing into one of the rooms as the action, you have to pick up your cards and look at them. Because if you were paying attention to the document I showed earlier of the distribution, investigators only have successes, which means if they don't pick up their cards and they just take one, well, you know that they're an investigator because they're not really paying close enough attention, unless it's like a super meta bluff from the cultist trying to be super uber sneaky and, you know, double play the game. But more often than not, especially when you're learning the game, it's just going to be someone carelessly saying, all of my cards are green checks, so I'm just going to take whatever one is off the top because I know they're all the same. So how meta you get and how big of a deal, that's sort of up to you. Again, it goes to that style of things where it's not going to be perfectly balanced, but how much do you want to read into it? Just like, say, Codenames, when you're trying to sabotage the other team and make sort of halfway remote connections to words that are down there. Does your group do that, or do they avoid that? Now, I mentioned you're drawing these book tiles based on what you're checking here with the room and seeing if it's success. You get to move one of these book tiles over here to score points. But again, sabotaging there potentially brings the book back. Was that the card that was down originally? Was that the card that somebody just placed? Who placed that one? You need to be careful. You need to read into it. But can you deduce it? That's where your mileage is going to vary. And let me be very clear, I've only touched on a portion of the rules, overviews, smatterings, actions. We literally have checking rooms, initiating a vote, using the camera to look elsewhere, restarting the power, or closing the portal, just in the base game alone that's in front of me as the room actions. Character actions are not limited, but are equal to check a state of somebody else, secure the hallway, scare off the fisherman, or fight a cultist. So things that are going to prohibit you or get in your way are sort of added in there on top of the move around, interact, and deduce. And some of those things work better. I mean, the cultists in the room stopping you from grabbing the books or laying down some of the marks are okay. The fisherman, needing to scare him away when he goes into the hallway with the knife, because the knife is passed to the first person. So you have this big cardboard knife that was necessary. It's okay. But again, it's one of those slight disconnects for me as a whole that I go, okay, that's nice and all. It's another thing, but does it work as well as all of the other concepts and mechanisms that are ingrained as well? And, that last one, especially, it isn't as much. It's nice, but if it wasn't there, would I miss it necessarily either? Maybe not. And the last thing, with the cultist, right? Cultist has to declare themselves at the end of the fourth phase, the cleanup phase, saying, hey, I think I've killed enough investigators. And you may already know who's dead, you may not. If you never check or search other people's decks in the first place because you don't want to find out that they're dead and lose their ability to interact on the map, well, that's going to be good, but you're also not going to know how close or far you are away from victory or defeat. Can you snatch it, or is it being snatched from you? A lot of this is based on randomness. Almost all of the tokens placed out are just completely random in terms of what's going to be in what room and how you're going to be able to mitigate that. And so if that's going to not appeal to you in a social deduction style manner, this game is going to fall flat. And also all of those alternative roles that I showed you here on the backside, I mean, that's maybe where it faults, comparatively in a more significant way to, say, Blood on the Clock Tower. I didn't feel like with some of these variants, they are just as useful. And if we take the other two expansions here, for example, the other issue that is with both of these is you have Mountains of Chaos and Down into the Abyss. Again, the rulebooks on these are probably even more difficult in terms of getting to know what you're doing with the variants. And the other aspect is that these are kind of almost whole box standalone expansions, sort of in-betweens, because you get a whole different setup of boards. It's not just minor intuitive things, it's a whole different board setup. And they're not compatible. You just use this one or the one that's provided in here, not either or, not modifications thereof. You need a whole other game essentially to get a whole other game. And that ultimately, for me, doesn't necessarily scream that I need it from a mechanistic standpoint. The mechanisms that are included can be very clever and very unique, but do I need a whole nother board to go along with it? And that's where I have a little bit of a mixed bag. When I talk about something like with my kids, Ghost Fighting Treasure Hunters is just one of the classic, most well-received, well-thought-of kids games that utilizes the same sort of, pandemic-style mechanic of getting the ghosts out of the rooms and bringing the treasure outside before you get overwhelmed. The additional expansion offers a little sideboard, and it twists the mechanics that are there, but just makes them more appealing from a mechanistic control standpoint, not a whole different smattering. And so if you're looking for, a whole different smattering of game and setup and area, the expansion is a must, but after a dozen plus plays, maybe, not anything less either. And how much are you going to do that? And again, from a playtime standpoint, this game, once you get flowing, the flow, again, is never the issue with this. The explanation, the setup, the minutia that you're making sure of and overarchingly taking care of with the iconography and the room-based situations so that you don't mess it up, that's where the issue is going to be. It reminds me a little bit more of Paint the Roses from North Star, where fantastic game, but if you mess up because you're not completely focused, it's going to make the game just completely fall flat. And you don't want that out of this. You want the experience that this can bring because it's a fun experience. But you need to be able to get there and stay there. And does your group have the focus to do that? So that's what you have to think of and be aware of more than anything else. So all in all, how do I feel about this game? Well, you know what? This is a great deduction game, but it's very clearly also not going to be for everyone because of how fragilely it can get broken. If you have the time and the group dynamic to really learn and repeated play, this is going to be more accessible, especially at a mid-player count range, 5 to 6, optimally, my preference, for those not able to play something like Blood on the Clock Tower. This is also going to be more dynamically easier than Stationfall. Personally speaking, I think I give the edge to Stationfall overall in terms of my personal enjoyment. However, this is also more accessible, and that can't be discounted. Do you need any of the expansions? Like I said, probably not unless you're going to play this, repeatedly. Otherwise, just the dynamics that the board offers you in the first place and how variable it is, because again, randomness being a very big key driving force here, every game is still going to be completely different, even with the same board actual setup in terms of the physical board. So you don't really need the other stuff. But if you are like a social deduction guru and you have extensive time invested in these games, then going through carefully and getting a expansion may be the best bet for you as well, to give a slight nuance in terms of additional mechanic, but also a completely different board layout as well. One thing I will ultimately say though, like I addressed earlier as one of the minor cons, is that the asymmetric characters are not as well fleshed out. It's a little bit more like Deduction Murder in Hong Kong, where they're there, but they are still not the main crux or the main focus, whereas with Blood in the Clock Tower, the emphasis is truly in those providing the life of the game. That is not the case here. Now, you're not going to necessarily suffer from it, but if you're looking for that particular dynamic, you may want to look elsewhere for the strongest games in that realm. So there you go. Pros, cons, and a little bit of everything else, all in a nutshell, hopefully not too long, among Cultists Godot games. There you go. Thoughts, questions, comments, concerns, new expansion on crowdfunding as well. There you go. Stay classy. Have a great freaking day.